Okay, we're ready to start. I hope you can all see and hear me. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to this Meet the Leader conversation with Jimmy Wales. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of Team LSE IDEAS, myself, Lutfey Siddiqi. We have Marta Kozielska, David Sutton, and Jess Keating also on the line. Two housekeeping points before we dive straight in. Firstly, this is being recorded. There's likely going to be a podcast and a video out of this soon. And secondly, please ask questions, ask a lot of questions, and ask them in real time as and when they occur to you using the Q&A feature on Zoom. And please keep them brief. Start with who you are and then the question, and hopefully we can scroll through as many of them as possible. So our guest speaker really doesn't require any introduction. When I sent the invitation out to some of the guests today, the range of feedback that came back, somebody described him as the most consistent of the original tech pioneer celebrities who's been true to his principles from the start to now. Somebody else described him as the guardian of all knowledge, which I don't know if it's true or not, but it's a bit like guardian of the galaxies. And then, Jimmy, I think I told you this in the past. I was looking to rent an apartment in London a few years ago, and the estate agent, as part of his marketing spiel, was keen to let me know that Jimmy Wales used to live here. And so that surely commands a premium. This session is, the audience space is primarily, but not restricted to, current and alumni members of the Executive Masters in Diplomacy and Strategy. It's a very wide range, senior diplomats to investment bankers and people in the middle. And they like to explore intersections of domains where the roles are blurred. You know, a lot of diplomacy is played out on social media right now. I just noticed that the Australian Prime Minister has tweeted that he baked some vegetarian samosas and tagged Prime Minister Modi of India, who then immediately responded. There may or may not be a message that they're not dim sums and they're samosas. So, you know, that's the space. And Jimmy, I just noticed that Breitbart is not happy with the fact, well, they say it's a fact that you called the Prime Minister, the US President Trump, something that they're not happy with. So Twitter is clearly, and social media has helped blur the lines in many respects. The style of this conversation is really about the leadership journey, and through your leadership journey, we will come to some of the more pressing and raging issues right now. There's a highly emotionally charged racial backdrop that we're in, backdrop of racial tensions that we're in right now. So if I may, if we could start your leadership journey with the creation story of Wikipedia and take it from there. Over to you.
Yeah, sure, great. Yeah, what I called the president was a lunatic. Not my more diplomatic moments, but it was actually in an interview with the Economic Times of India, and they were actually kind enough afterwards to email me to say, well, we're editing the interview. Do you want us to take out that bit? And I thought, no, I'm all right with it. It has to be said. So the founding story of Wikipedia. Well, so I was 2 years before the founding of Wikipedia. I launched a project called Newpedia, which was the same vision, the idea of a free encyclopedia for everyone, written by volunteers in all the languages of the world. But I didn't really know how to create it. So I hired a PhD in philosophy who was the editor-in-chief, Larry Sanger, and we devised a system for creating Newpedia, a global universal encyclopedia that was actually even more academic than a traditional encyclopedia. Larry made the argument, and he was right, given the context of what we knew at that time, that unless we were super academic and super serious, that people would make fun of us, that it was a joke, and so on. And so we had to be more academic than Britannica, for example. And so we created a 7-stage review process to get anything published. You had to actually fax in your CV to show you were qualified to write. That was one of the 7 steps. And what was interesting about it, well, first of all, it was incredibly slow. The process was really intimidating to volunteers, and I'll come on to that in a moment. But it was slow, but it was also very imperfect. One of the first things that we published, which had gone through this 7-stage review process, including peer review by professors and so forth, within a very short period of time after it was published, someone contacted us to say, this is plagiarism, and found the original article, and it has clearly been plagiarized. And so we pulled it down immediately. And so that was interesting, because we had this very serious system. It actually didn't work as well as we would have liked. So we were struggling. We had gotten when we pulled the plug on Nupedia, I think we had published 24 articles in a little around 2 years' time. So it was very, very slow. It was going to be a long time before we produced anything of real value. And I decided to start to figure out what's so hard about this, what's wrong. And so I thought, well, my background was in finance. I was working on a PhD in finance and left that and became a futures and options trader in Chicago, and had a published paper on options pricing theory, on the pricing of index options when all of the underlying assets follow anyway, it was very long. It was stochastic differential equations and so on. And so I sat down to write about Robert Merton, who was one of the leading pioneers in option pricing theory. And I had worked through all of his academic papers. I knew his work very well. I thought I can just write a short biography of him. And I sat down to write, and it was absolutely no fun. It was very intimidating. It was, I felt like I was back in grad school again. They were going to take my work and send it to the most prestigious finance professors they could find to critique and review it. It was very much not fun. And that was when I realized, look, this isn't going to work. Like, no one, a handful of people are really excited about the concept, but this is too hard. This is not fun to do. So one of my employees, Jeremy Rosenfeld, came to me and showed me Wiki. And that was a really interesting thing. The idea had been around. A guy called Ward Cunningham, a very well-known developer, had created the first wiki many, many years before that. And we decided to try a wiki. So a wiki just means a website anybody can edit. It comes from a Hawaiian word, wiki, which means quick. The idea is quick collaboration. And because we were concerned about, would this be taken seriously? Would our existing community, who were largely quite academic, be opposed to it or upset by it? So we didn't want to put it on the Nupedia domain name, so we set up Wikipedia. And so I put the software up, and really in 2 weeks we had more work done than we had in almost 2 years before. It was really an unleashing of people's desire to participate and their excitement about the vision and the idea.
Did you not think about a revenue model at the time?
Well, this is 2001, so we were still sort of in the dot-com boom era, and therefore it didn't seem all that important to think about a revenue model. In the early days, I just thought, well, it needs to exist. This should happen. What should the revenue model be? Never really thought it should be advertising. Definitely didn't think it should be a paywall model. Certainly, we come from the free software community, or the open source software world, where everybody contributes and gives everything away under a free license, and everything in Wikipedia is freely licensed, so you can do whatever you want with it. And coming from that world and that set of values, it's like, no, this is an intellectual exercise that we're going to enjoy doing. We'll figure out a revenue model later. And in fact, we've never officially said in any sort of formal way. Wikipedia will never have advertising, but nobody's in favor of it. We never discuss it. It's not even a thing. It's not on our radar. And actually, some of our early decisions now really do resonate in a very deep way with a lot of the problems that we're seeing. So I can tell you, no one is going to start politically targeting you with advertisements based on what you've been reading in Wikipedia, because we don't track that. We don't share that data. I mean, it's even our level of internal tracking is so minimal, you wouldn't believe it. So we actually have no idea what you're reading in Wikipedia. And you can imagine how that kind of data would be used today, given sophisticated machine learning algorithms. You know, if you're reading about, I don't know, pick a random topic, you're suddenly going to see, you know, a few days later, an advertisement saying, sort of making some political case based on knowing what you're interested in, you know, and you know, people who like gardening, you know, my candidate is the gardener. So, you know, well, we don't do that. It's all, it's very much, we're probably the best of any major website in terms of protecting people's privacy.
Right, I will come to that later on as we talk about a couple of your more recent ventures. But Wikipedia, this concept of open editing, crowdsourcing, about 7 years ago now, 2013, I wrote a blog for the WEF at the time. The topic of the risk report was digital wildfire. And at that time, we were all pretty convinced that Wikipedia is a self-correcting organism, that, you know, the half-life of an error is a few minutes and so on. Today, we hear more complaints about incorrect information remaining for a long time. People complain about, hey, my bio is not correct, and so on and so forth. What is your view on that self-editing, self-correcting feature? What is the governance of Wikipedia, the Wikimedia construct, and does that intervene?
Yeah, so a lot of people have a mental model of Wikipedia, that it's a million people adding one sentence each, and that it's complete sort of anarchy. And that isn't really how it works at all. It's really a core group of volunteers who are managing and supervising and overseeing everything. And that includes people who are the administrators, who are elected by the community. And there are many different institutional structures within the community. So we have the administrators, of course, but then we also have an arbitration committee, which deals with very intractable, difficult disputes. They are elected by the community and then formally, in the English Wikipedia, formally appointed by me, but that's, my role is like the queen. I don't actually get to choose anything. It's a formality. And there are many, many different things, like what we call a wiki project. So just to give one example, Wiki Project Bridges is a group of people who are interested in the architecture and history of bridges, and they go through all of the articles about bridges, and they rate them for quality, and they have a whole system of every bridge article should contain these basic features and so on, and they go through and do all that. There's Wiki Project Gastropods, which is about snails and so forth. And so, or actually an important one, particularly recently, is Wiki Project Medicine, which is one of the most fearsome sort of strong groups in Wikipedia, who look after all of the medical entries. One of our board members, Doc James, as we call him in the community, is one of the leaders in that group. And they've had a huge responsibility during the COVID-19 outbreak in terms of judging the quality of reference materials and making sure that it's neutral and high quality as much as possible. So it's very far from being a random anarchy. And I believe that, you know, every study that I've seen that's a serious look at things puts our error rate, you know, it's in the ballpark of a traditional encyclopedia, in many cases lower error rate than in traditional encyclopedias. And we have a lot of rules. So the editorial rules of Wikipedia are, you know, we require reliable sources, and we judge the reliable sources in a, you know, it's a sophisticated way. Obviously, it's a very simple concept in one sense, but what counts as a reliable source versus not a reliable source? And that becomes very tricky. I remember a few years ago, I hadn't seen or noticed the discussion going on, but a decision was made on a vote of the community to deprecate the Daily Mail as a reliable source. And as you might imagine, the Daily Mail took the news very gracefully, haha. You know, they went insane. They actually doorstopped one of the volunteers who had been involved in the discussion. You know, it was pretty silly, but, you know, we just said, look, there's almost always a better source. Sometimes it's okay to use the Daily Mail as a source if it's the only source of something. And they do occasionally do journalism and break a story, but they also run a lot of inflammatory kind of hyped up stuff. They run actual fake news. And so you just can't say, it wouldn't be your preferred place to go for an encyclopedic reference. So all of those things, you know, effectively mean that it is self-correcting. Now, there can be problems, of course, and some of the problems, frankly, more often than not, have to do with something being obscure enough that people haven't looked into it. Now, no one thinks their own biography is obscure, of course. We're human beings, and it feels quite important. But oftentimes, when someone, you know, mentions a concern, it's just a matter of going on the talk page and explaining, or pasting a link on the talk page, preferably, not on, you know, you shouldn't edit your own page. It's bad form, but just say, hey, look, did you miss, you know, I left that job, here's the announcement, or here's the new job, and that sort of thing. And so that's, you know, that's the sort of thing. And then other times people are unhappy, you know, because the entry talks about a scandal that they've had, and that's sometimes quite difficult, because if the scandal was covered in reliable sources and so on and so forth, it's part of history, and it may be uncomfortable, but there it is. The question is it handled, you know, in a neutral way, fairly, and all of that? And there's always the possibility of a discussion.
Okay, so it's definitely not, it's not perfect, but it's not the wild, wild west. There is clearly.
Yeah.
On that, where do you stand in the two schools of thought? Twitter right now choosing to fact check and annotate Trump's tweets, whereas Facebook apparently taking more of a laissez-faire approach. Do you have a position on that spectrum?
Well, I think, so for Wikipedia, this is a completely different question. We don't think of ourselves in any way as a place that people should come and post their random thoughts and opinions.
Right.
So our entry about Donald Trump should be neutral. If you want to call Donald Trump a lunatic, you don't do it on Wikipedia. That's not the right venue for that. You know, so for us, the problem for us is actually much simpler. We're trying to write an encyclopedia, and so we don't really encourage or you know, it's like, whatever your opinion is, it doesn't matter. This is an encyclopedia. It's not about your opinions, and so on and so forth. So Twitter and Facebook face a very, very difficult problem. They've set themselves up as, this is a place for people to post their thoughts, whatever their thoughts might be. And if we step back from the fact-checking question for a moment and step back from the Trump question, that's always going to be a hard thing. Some people's random thoughts and opinions are offensive. They're wrong. Sometimes they're just merely wrong. They're not actually offensive, but people are just mistaken about something. Sometimes they're quite bonkers, you know, conspiracy theories and things like that. And unless that speech is illegal, right, which I think everybody agrees that something should be done about it, but even there, illegal is a complicated question in the global sense. In some places, it might be illegal. In Thailand, it's illegal to criticize the king, which most people in the West would say, well, you should be able to criticize the Queen of England, you know, whatever it might be. And so even that is a tough call for them. So where do I come down on this? Like, it's a really hard problem. So one of the things, I want to imagine a different set of historical circumstances. And it's not hard to imagine if Facebook had started 5 years ago saying, we're going to start using our judgment to fact check things, remove things, to comment on things, and we're actually going to maybe impact the algorithm as to what gets shared more widely and less widely. I think we would have all gone pretty insane and said, whoa, hold on a second. We don't want Facebook to become Mark Zuckerberg's tool for
Worldview.
manipulating public opinion, right? And to his credit, he doesn't seem to want to do that, and that's good. On the other hand, we know these platforms have been very vulnerable to mass manipulation through algorithmic manipulation, bot armies, this, that, and the other. It has happened to me a few times. It might be today. I actually said this lunatic comment to a newspaper in India, but today Breitbart covered it. And normally that's a trigger. But so far I didn't get any real abuse about it. But, well, I mean, a little, but that's Twitter, you know.
That's
but
a trigger for what? Do you think?
A trigger for a bot attack, because this is what's
okay.
happened to me before. And it's quite clear when it happens. You're suddenly getting hundreds and thousands of very similarly formatted messages. That's clearly somebody's pushed a button somewhere to sort of pollute the space. So they're vulnerable to that sort of thing. We do know that misinformation, disinformation is a huge problem right now. And so I think that it's a good thing if Twitter is fact-checking the president's tweets. I think that's a good thing, but they're really stepping into a very difficult space, because can they fact-check everybody? Can they fact-check neutrally? How are they going to make those judgment calls? It's a really tough problem. I'm sympathetic to how hard that problem is. But what I think they both should do, so on that question, maybe I can see the arguments, and they both should be working really, really hard on this manipulation, this, you know, armies of bots and trolls and things like that. That is really what makes the platforms much lower quality. And I think that's a problem.
Right. I remember you had spoken out about the Rohingya situation in Myanmar, and you know, allegedly some of that was stoked on Facebook. And so situations like that, I don't know if there should be intervention mechanisms, or is it just too hard?
I mean, I think it's really complicated. I mean, I think clearly in some cases, if information is going around that could be harmful, and we can think of very simple kind of cases where the harm is clear, imminent, you know, this is wrong information that potentially can affect people's health in a very short-term way, I think the platforms ought to get involved. Now, I'm not saying they should be legally required to. I'm saying what I think they should do to be good companies. But, you know, we've seen these conspiracy theories about 5G and coronavirus. It's complete nonsense, but as long as it isn't causing people to go out and burn down 5G towers, which has happened, okay, the best answer for that is more speech and more explanation to people. But I do think they could flag, you know, what I've always said is, if you start to share something that's been flagged, you know, Facebook or Twitter could say to you, hey, before you share this, do you want to go and check out this fact check? Because if you go check it out and you still want to share it, that's fine. Like, that's your responsibility. But let me know. I mean, I always give this amusing example where I almost shared fake news. And basically what it was, I read an article that said scientists have published research showing what we always believed to be true is true, which is that if your cat were big enough, it would eat you. And I chuckled, and my daughter has cats, and of course everybody loves to joke about cats that would probably pounce on us and kill us if they could, but you know, they're little, so they don't. And so it's funny, and everybody chuckles when you hear it. But just as I was about to share it with my daughter, I thought, hold on a second. Let me think about this for a second. And I looked, and I'm like, it doesn't actually give a link to the study. It gives the name of one author, but not the title of the paper. So I searched on Google anyway. I found the paper, and it said there are some psychological traits that are similar between large cats and small cats, which we all knew. It says nothing about your cat eating you, right? And so somebody, a cute, you know, it was probably a funny intern at a, you know, it was not a reliable source kind of publication. They saw a good clickbaity headline, something funny to write. They wrote it, shared it, it went viral. And that kind of stuff is harmless enough, but, you know, it's out there.
Yes. We'll come back to fake news more generally in just a moment. Right. Just to finish off on Wikipedia, we have two questions. They're related. They're both from Malina, and I'll read out both of them. How will Wikipedia evolve to meet increased online learning needs in this COVID-19 era? And how will Wikipedia compete with other information sites like Quora which not only has facts, but also this upvoting function and critical analysis.
Right. So, you know, I think in terms of evolving, I mean, I think we're already a core part of online learning. We aren't, I, like many people, as you can see, I'm in my attic bedroom of my house here in the UK, and I'm at home, and actually because I'm traveling all over the world all the time, and now I'm not traveling. So I've been doing programming courses. I'm a programmer, but I'm rusty because I don't get to do it on a day-to-day basis. I've been having fun, and I'm doing online programming, and it's fantastic, right? What I'm doing, though, it's instructional, you know, it's step-by-step. Some of these instructors online are very good. It's not really right for Wikipedia. Wikipedia is an encyclopedia. And so I don't think we should evolve into something for that. However, if I'm interested in a particular technology, so Laravel is a PHP framework, Wikipedia is a good place to go and just get that basic summary. What is Laravel? What's the history of it? What is it used for? And so on and so forth. And so I think that our role as an encyclopedia shouldn't really change. I don't think we should try to become online tutorials and things like that. We do have a couple of projects, Wikiversity and Wikibooks, which are more about learning materials. They've never been super successful, but they've got great small communities and people are creating things and so on. So that's kind of interesting. In terms of the other question, Quora. So I love Quora. I have more followers on Quora than I do on Facebook and Twitter combined, last time I checked. And I think that's because, I mean, I'm on Twitter like everybody's on Twitter, but really, you know, that 280 characters is not my style. I'm more of like a 5-paragraph kind of guy. So people ask a question there, I enjoy writing answers and so forth. And it's a different experience. So again, I don't think we compete with Quora. I think it's a different model entirely, and it's what you go there for is different entirely. If I want to say, you know, I saw a question, I might have answered a question. What are some great spots for a date in London? And I thought, oh, well, my wife and I live in London, and I go out to different places, and I can't remember if I actually wrote the answer or I just wanted to, but, you know, give some tips of places people would go and things like that. That's just personal advice from somebody who's bored online and old and knows a few things about London. And it wouldn't belong in Wikipedia. It's a completely different kind of area of human knowledge. And so, you know, all that. The other thing is about the voting, I think is really interesting. So if you've got a question, there can be multiple answers to a question. They might be of greater or lower quality, and so the upvoting helps to filter and get the better answers towards the top. It's imperfect, but, you know, I think Quora does a decent job of it. At Wikipedia, we've always shied away from voting. We don't like voting as a mechanism, and even oftentimes when there is a vote. So for example, let's say somebody thinks a certain entry should be deleted. And this happens, this is something that does happen with fairly regularly. Somebody says, oh, I don't like this Lutfey character and he's in Wikipedia, let's get him deleted. And so on some message board where people, sort of the anti-Lutfey fan club hangs out, they say, we're all gonna go and we're gonna vote for this to be deleted and he'll be deleted from Wikipedia. So then somebody nominates for deletion and then there's a deletion discussion that happens. This is the way it works. And you'll see there'll be like 40 votes, delete, he's a jerk, delete, I don't like him, delete, I failed his class, whatever it might be. And then one Wikipedian will say, actually, look at his biography, look at the sources and references, this is a perfectly valid biography. And then the closing administrator doesn't count the votes. That's not what it's about. The voting is really a discussion. And they may say, well, look, in this case, the votes say delete, but obviously all these votes from people we've never heard of before aren't for policy reasons. I'm going to discount those and I'm not going to do it. This is very common that we use judgment. We use dialogue, discussion, debate, we chew on things. And so voting mechanisms are quite easily gameable. You have to go to a lot of work to make sure that you don't have bot armies sort of going in and voting and creating fake votes and things like that. And in our situation, it's like, no, you've got to give a valid policy-based reason, otherwise your vote doesn't count.
Right. Thank you. Two more questions from the audience. Fatima, LSE student, Masters in International Strategy and Diplomacy. Very general question. Last week, you called President Trump a lunatic. Do you believe there is a new isolationism in America? And is it about America, or is it the current leadership? I'll come back to the second question. Let you answer.
Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting question. I mean, I obviously, you know, one of the things that I see rising all around the world is a certain form of isolationism in many, many places, a rise of a new kind of nationalism. We see it in the US quite clearly. Well, here in the UK, we voted for Brexit. We see in Brazil, we see Hungary, we see a lot of places a certain authoritarianism that's deeply rooted in nationalism and nationalist type of arguments. And so the kind of values that I think Wikipedia best represents, which is we're open, we're all human beings on this planet, we're in all languages, we're trying to do something that is of universal value in the long haul, is kind of not as popular these days. And we see the rise of, I mean, I think if you go and look at the Twitter mentions of me calling President Trump a lunatic, there's a lot of assumption that I'm left-wing and that's why I don't like Trump. Well, it has really very little to do with his political positions. I mean, some of them I very much disagree with. Some of them I think, yeah, that's actually what I would think would be the right thing to do. But it's just about that he's a lunatic, you know, so that's completely separate from politics. And so I don't know if it's just the current leadership. Clearly Trump does a lot to inflame hatred of the other, whatever the other might be. It might be foreigners, it might be Mexicans, it might be Black people in inner cities, people who don't vote for Trump, those kinds of things. And obviously he is driving a lot of it, but since we see it in so many places around the world, I think it's part of a broader, more general trend, more general problem. If I had the solution to it, I don't know, I would.
Right.
I don't know.
I will take two questions from the audience and lump it into something I was going to ask you anyway. Before that, a question from Abdul Rahman from Turkey, I believe. Do you think the moderation of English Wikipedia reflects the prejudices and biases of the Western world on areas that are conflicted, areas of inter-civilisational dispute?
So that's a fantastic question. And I have a kind of a multi-layered answer. So one initial answer is, don't think about the moderation and the people who are moderators for a moment. I'll get to them in a moment. But the first thing that we say in Wikipedia is we depend on reliable sources. Our opinions and thoughts aren't important. It's gathering information from quality sources. And as it turns out, if there is a general consensus in the English language media about a particular thing, then Wikipedia is going to reflect that. Now, there are people who are multilingual. We do try. There's no rule that says you can't cite another language source, but it's obviously less common and it's difficult because if most people can't read it, you've got to explain why, you've got to bring all this in. And so to the extent that our media is failing to be neutral, is failing to thoughtfully look at all sides of a conflict, then naturally, of course, Wikipedia will. Where we see this most obviously come up is sometimes around fairly obscure conflicts where there are almost no one discusses it at all. So various, there's a little island that is a border dispute between South Korea and Japan. It's really not important. It's just a point of contention they've had for decades. And I was told, I can't read either Korean or Japanese, that the two versions are quite different, but that someone had realized it who was bilingual in those two languages and they were trying to make both of them neutral. But the point was, it wasn't because anybody set out with a sort of anti the other side mindset. It's just like what everybody knew. Maybe a more familiar example is, who invented the airplane? Most English speakers say the Wright brothers, because we learned it when we were 8 years old, and it's completely uncontroversial fact. It's actually much more complicated than that. And in France, you'll get a different answer. And so hopefully then Wikipedia evolves over time to give a more sophisticated, nuanced explanation of something rather than taking one side or the other. Now then we can move as well. So that's about the sourcing. Then we can move to the moderators. So these are the people who are elected as administrators or actually just really active Wikipedians who may not be admins, but who do a lot of writing. And I think that the spirit in our community with good Wikipedians is to combat that as much as possible. To say we're not here to simply reflect our own prejudices. We need to consider all sides, even things we disagree with. But this is a human process, and humans are not always that good at it, even when we try to be. So, for example, I would personally never edit the entry on Donald Trump because I'm very upset. I'm emotional about him. So I don't feel that I could be a good Wikipedian in that area. But some other conflict that doesn't really impact my life, I'm a very good Wikipedian. I could go in and help people who are having a conflict, try and find some balance, try and find a way to accommodate all the reasonable people in that area. So it's a process and it isn't perfect, but in general, we try.
There's a question from Raquel Vasquez, which I think you did touch on earlier. Can you comment in particular about the Oversight Board set up by Facebook?
Yeah, I probably can't very much because I haven't actually studied the exact details of it or who is on it. In general, I can say, I do think it's a good idea for Facebook to have some kind of an independent body that helps them judge this sort of thing. Nobody wants Facebook to become Mark Zuckerberg's window on the world. Nor do we want complete chaos to reign on Facebook. And so one technique for that would be to empower an oversight board, but also you have to empower them. They can't merely be an advisory body. Facebook has to really respect what they decide and go along with it. So interesting approach. I don't think it's a terrible idea.
So Hiba Chamas, also from the LSE Strategy Diplomacy Program, an alumni. The question is, who should be the organization policing the factfulness of tweets, post shares, articles, etc. on Facebook? Should it be each company, Facebook and Twitter themselves? Should there be unified kind of factful checkers that consolidate? Let me park that for the moment. You may weave that into my question, because I don't want to run out of time for that, which is your current or more recent two ventures, Wiki Tribune and WT.Social, which I understand to be as attempts to counter the issue of fake news. Could you tell us a bit more about those, please, and what lessons we learn on how to combat and how not to combat fake news?
Yeah, right. So Wiki Tribune, and then the recent incarnation, WT.Social, which is Wiki Tribune Social. I just found a short domain name and started to use it. The concept is to say, look, we know there's this problem of misinformation, disinformation being shared widely online. We need to figure out some alternatives. So my first attempt at this was to say, look, let's notice that. So going back in the history of all this. So if you go to any newspaper website, and then you go down to the comments, those newspapers that still have comments, a lot of them have discontinued it. And what you see in the comments is basically the worst people in humanity yelling at each other. It's not particularly useful. It's not helpful. Journalists find it painful to look at because there's insults and it's just not generally that good. And so if you approach the world with that framework, you would say, well, look, the general public is full of angry idiots. They can't really help with the process of journalism. But then you take a look at Wikipedia and you go, hold on a second. There are these really kind, thoughtful people who try really hard, who've created this amazing thing as a gift to the world. It isn't perfect, but boy, you know, if you said, look, if we had some Wikipedians commenting in that Wikipedia style, that could be actually quite interesting. And so I wanted to merge the two. I wanted to say, okay, how do we do journalism, but also bring in that community element in a really deep and integrated way? And that was the first sort of iteration with Wiki Tribune. And basically learned a lot of detailed things that are too detailed to go into here. But effectively, part of what I learned was that actually the problem isn't necessarily with the journalistic process. There's still a lot of great journalism going on. It has to do with the whole ecosystem where journalism has to live. So we noticed, for example, we had one of our most popular stories, and we thought, oh, this is popular. For the first time, we're getting like a huge surge of traffic. We should do more like this. And then you start to look at your headlines and you think, oh, well, if this headline's kind of boring. If it were a more jazzy headline, suddenly you're like, hold on a second, I'm not trying to build BuzzFeed here. I don't want to build a popular website with clickbaity headlines and fluffy content. That's been done. I'm not interested in that. So then I said, look, the real problem is that viral sharing mechanism, that distribution. And here's where I would say the business model of, and we've been talking a lot about Twitter and Facebook, the business model of Twitter and Facebook, I think, is fundamentally at odds with them solving the problem of fake news. Their incentives are quite simple. They want you on the website as much as possible. They want you clicking. They want, time on site to be high, viewing as many ads as possible. And what that means is that controversy gets people clicking. There's a very famous web cartoon where somebody says to their partner, oh, honey, please, it's late, come to bed. And the person responds, I can't, someone is wrong on the internet. And we've all had that experience that, why am I even looking at Twitter? It's because I've got to sort these people out, right? It's a very human impulse, but it's not healthy and it isn't right. And so I've launched with WT.Social, I said, look, well, let's forego that advertising business model. So the business model at WT.Social is pay if you want to. You don't have to pay, no paywall. I've been joking, no advertising, no paywall. So a series of bad business decisions, but that's how I've built my career so far. But what that does for me is to say, look, now I have every incentive to build something that if you don't have to pay for it unless you want to, you're not going to pay unless you think, you know what, this is meaningful. Like, this is important to my life. This should live. This is worth doing. And so the incentives of what you're building and why become very, very different from trying to get people addicted and so on and so forth. So that's kind of the approach that I'm taking right now. And as a part of that—
How can people find WT.Social if they want to take part in that, contribute to that? How can they?
WT.Social and just come and sign up. It's quite easy. We've got nearly 500,000 members. We're constantly working on the software and improving things. We've just recently created the ability to blue tick people and to promote people on the platform. One of the things that I realized that I got wrong in the early months was really super interesting people would come on the platform and nobody noticed and nobody followed them. And if you're an interesting person wanting to use social media professionally or whatever, you need an audience and you need people to find you and so on. So we've improved that, and a lot of other little details are improving how you do sharing and all that. But it's a pilot project. It's something that is a work in progress. And yeah, if anybody signs up and uses it, send me your complaints because I want to hear them.
Great. Are you still keeping faith that people will pay, or they are paying, or?
Yeah. People are paying. I mean, we run it. We're a tiny team, but we run at break even or so, and we've got enough money to keep programming and keep developing and so on. And I think if I build something people like, they'll pay for it. It's sort of like in the early days of Wikipedia. It's a thing that needs to exist.
Yes.
I don't know if I know how to create it, but I'm going to try. And if I do create something, I'm confident we can find a way.
Fabulous. Last question from Norden Shalabna, LSE alumna. What are the recent global trends that affect Wikipedia in light of the COVID-19 pandemic? So again, a grand question.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we can talk in a less grand way about the most direct impact, which is that traffic to Wikipedia is way up. As expected, if people are going out to bars and restaurants, they're not on Wikipedia, but if they're sitting at home, they end up on Wikipedia quite a lot. So we're seeing a lot. I think that there's also an element we touched earlier on online education. I think all of the online education platforms are seeing massive increases in activity and traffic. A lot of people who are furloughed in the UK or whatever. One of the things that people can do is training, and I think a lot of people are thinking it's going to be a tough recession after this, and I better get my skills up. So I think there's a lot of that impacts Wikipedia indirectly. And then broader global trends. I think
data privacy, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, most of that doesn't affect us because we don't do anything with people's data
track.
anyway. So we don't have any intention of changing any of that. I think, well, in a serious recession, obviously we worry a little bit about people's ability to donate. But the foundation has had a very, Wikipedia is run by the Wikimedia Foundation, which is the charity I set up that owns and operates it. And, it's been financially good for some time. So we've got a decent cushion. We're fine, but we do worry if we see a significant drop in donations, that could be a problem. On the other hand, if people are finding us meaningful and useful in their lives during lockdown, then even though they might not contribute this year, hopefully they'll remember us next year when the economy's back. And then finally, the last thing I would mention in terms of a global trend that I think about impacting Wikipedia is, as I say, the rise of this kind of nationalism and hatred of others, which is a really antithesis of the Wikipedia mentality. And if that continues and carries on, obviously what begins to happen are threats of fragmentation of the internet, threats of blocking websites. We were blocked in Turkey for quite a long time. We won finally our case with the Supreme Court in Turkey and were unblocked in Turkey. But that kind of thing might happen more often, that regimes, try to paint us as a foreign website with foreign propaganda, even though actually it's just they don't want neutrality about themselves. So, those are concerns that we have.
Certainly something for the strategy and diplomacy folk here to think about. So on that, it is 47 past the hour, so we're giving you plenty of time for your next engagement. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jimmy. It's been, as expected, very inspirational and very knowledgeable.
Fantastic, yeah. And someday I'll come in person.
Yes, please do.
And sit on the sofas. So, all right, very good. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for all the attendees as well. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.